They told him once, long ago, that trouble doesn't knock twice. It just waits until you open the door yourself. And Ethan Cole remembered that as the sun dropped low over the dry hills, casting long shadows across his empty yard, when he saw the small figure standing at the edge of his porch, barefoot, unmoving, as if she had been carved out of the same dust that covered his land, and for a moment he didn't reach for the handle, didn't speak, just stood there with his hand resting against the wood, feeling the quiet stretch between them like a held breath, because out here, 40 miles from the nearest town, nothing arrived by accident. Not cattle, not men, and certainly not a child with dark eyes that didn't ask for help. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and dry earth as it brushed past her, lifting strands of her black hair, just enough to reveal the thin silver bracelet wrapped around her wrist. Dull with age, but unmistakably cared for. And Ethan felt something shift in his chest, something he had buried years ago beneath routine and silence. He had lived alone on this patch of land for 8 years, ever since the world decided it had no more use for a man who asked too many questions and trusted too easily. His days were measured in fence posts and hoof prints, his nights in the low crackle of a fire that never quite warmed the whole room. And yet here she was, standing without fear, without even the courtesy of a plea, just watching him like she had already decided something about him that he hadn't decided about himself. He finally opened the door an inch, just enough for the hinges to whisper against the frame. "You lost?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. The girl didn't answer, didn't move. Her eyes flicked briefly past him, toward the dark interior of the cabin, then back to his face, and that was when he noticed the way she held herself. Not like a child who had wandered too far, but like someone who had walked exactly where she meant to, mile after mile, under a sky that offered no kindness. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing out toward the horizon where the land stretched flat and empty for as far as a man could ride in half a day. No tracks, no dust trails, no sign of anyone who might come looking, and yet the air felt heavier than it should, like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break. He stepped aside without thinking, the movement small, almost reluctant, but final all the same. "Just for the night," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. She walked past him without hesitation, her steps silent on the worn wooden floor, and for a second the cabin didn't feel like his anymore, like it had shifted to make room for something he didn't understand. He closed the door behind her, the latch settling into place with a soft click that sounded louder than it should. The girl moved toward the table, her gaze drifting over the few objects that filled the room. A tin cup, a folded blanket, a coil of rope resting in the corner. Nothing worth stealing, nothing worth noticing. And yet her eyes lingered on each item as if she were measuring them against something unseen. Ethan poured water into the cup and set it down in front of her. She hesitated, just for a second, then took it with both hands, drinking slowly, carefully, like someone who knew the value of every drop. He watched the bracelet again as it caught the last sliver of sunlight slipping through the window, the metal etched with faint markings he couldn't quite place, but the pattern stirred a memory he couldn't fully reach, like a name on the edge of his tongue. "You got a name?" he asked, softer. This time, the girl lowered the cup and looked at him, really looked, as if deciding whether the question deserved an answer. Then she shook her head once, not in refusal, but in something closer to delay. Ethan frowned slightly, leaning back against the wall, arms crossed, trying to make sense of the quiet that seemed to follow her. Most children would have spoken by now, would have cried or asked for food, or at least shown some sign of being lost, but she did none of that. She simply existed in the space, steady, patient, like she was waiting for something he hadn't noticed yet. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the side of the cabin in long, low strokes. The horses in the small corral shifted uneasily there, hooves scraping against dry dirt. Ethan's gaze flicked toward the window, his instincts stirring in a way they hadn't in years. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when something doesn't add up. He pushed off the wall and stepped outside. The evening air cooler now, the sky painted in fading orange and deepening blue. He scanned the distance again, slower this time, more careful. Still nothing, No riders, no movement. Just the endless stretch of land that had once promised him peace. He stood there for a long moment, listening, the kind of listening that goes beyond sound, searching for the absence of it. And that was when he felt it, not a noise, not a sight, but a presence, faint and distant, like someone watching from just beyond where the light could reach. Ethan's jaw tightened as he turned back toward the cabin. The door still closed, the girl inside, quiet as before, and for the first time since she had arrived, he realized something that settled heavy in his chest. She hadn't come here by accident, and whatever had followed her wasn't far behind. The night settled and slower than usual, like it had something to watch. And Ethan Cole did not light the lantern right away. He let the last gray of daylight stretch thin across the cabin walls while he stood near the window, listening to the horses shift outside with a restlessness that did not belong to wind or hunger. The girl sat at the table where he had left her, hands folded loosely around the empty tin cup, her eyes no longer scanning the room, but fixed somewhere distant, as if she could see beyond the walls into whatever waited out there in the dark. Ethan moved at last, striking a match and bringing a small flame to life. The light flickered low and steady, casting long shadows that bent and swayed with each quiet movement. He set the lantern down between them and studied her more carefully now, not as a stranger passing through, but as something that had chosen his door for a reason he did not yet understand. Her clothes were worn but not torn, dusted from travel but not careless. Her feet bare, but uninjured, which meant she had walked far and carefully. Someone had taught her how to move across land without leaving much behind. His gaze dropped again to the bracelet on her wrist, the silver catching the lantern light in a dull, familiar way. And the longer he looked at it, the more certain he became that he had seen that pattern before, not in a store, not in town, but somewhere quieter, somewhere that did not belong to the world he lived in now. "You did not wander here," he said finally, his voice softer than before, but steadier. The girl lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time there was something in them that shifted, not fear, not trust, but recognition, as if she had been waiting for him to say exactly that. She shook her head once, slow and certain, and the room seemed to tighten around that small motion. Ethan exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the door, then back to her. "Then someone sent you," he continued, more to test the truth than to demand it. The girl did not answer with words, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. And that was enough. Outside, a soft sound drifted across the yard, not loud, not sharp, but wrong, the kind of sound that does not belong unless something else is present. Ethan turned his head toward it instantly. The years he had spent out here rising back into his bones like they had never left. He stepped toward the door, but did not open it. Instead, he rested his hand flat against the wood, feeling for any vibration, any shift, anything that might confirm what his instincts already whispered. Nothing came, just silence. Stretched too thin, he stepped back and moved to the small window instead, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to look out. The yard lay still under the early night, the fence casting long dark lines across the ground. The horses now standing closer together than before, their heads turned toward the far edge of the property. Ethan followed their gaze, scanning the distance. And there was again, not a figure, not clearly, but a presence. A darker shape against the darkness itself. Too still to be wind, too deliberate to be nothing. His jaw set as he lowered the curtain, turning back toward the girl, who had not moved, had not even looked toward the door, as if she already knew what he had seen. "You brought someone with you," he said, not accusing, not angry, just stating what had become undeniable. The girl's expression did not change, but she slowly slid her hand across the table, turning her wrist so the bracelet faced upward, offering it without speaking. Ethan stepped closer, hesitating only a second before leaning down to look. The markings were clearer now in the lantern light. Etched lines forming a pattern that twisted and curved in a way that made his chest tighten. He reached out but stopped short of touching it. Something about the gesture felt heavier than it should, like it would confirm more than he was ready to face. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. The girl's lips parted slightly, and for a moment it seemed like she might speak, but instead she lowered her gaze. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, careful, deliberate. she said you would remember. The words settled into the room like dust, slow and impossible to ignore. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs in a way that had nothing to do with breath, his mind reaching backward through years he had spent trying not to revisit, years that had blurred into routine and silence. And yet the sound of that voice, the shape of those words, pulled something forward that refused to stay buried. Outside, the faint shape beyond the fence shifted, just slightly, enough to break the illusion of stillness, enough to confirm that whoever waited out there had no intention of leaving. Ethan straightened, his eyes flicking once more toward the window before returning to the girl. "Who is she?" he asked, the question heavier now, not just curiosity, but something closer to certainty. The girl lifted her head again, and this time there was no hesitation in her gaze, no uncertainty, only a quiet resolve that did not belong to someone her age. "My mother," she said, and the word did not sound simple, did not sound small. It carried weight, history, something unfinished. Ethan's fingers curled slightly at his side as the memory he had been avoiding finally took shape. A woman standing by a river years ago, the same silver catching the light in the same quiet way, a look in her eyes that had stayed with him longer than it should have. And as he stood there in the dim lantern glow, the distance between then and now collapsing into a single moment, he understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The girl had not come to him for shelter. She had come because the past he had walked away from had finally found its way back. The word lingered longer than it should have. Mother, simple in shape, but heavy in meaning, and Ethan Cole did not answer right away. He stood there with the lantern light shifting across his face, watching the girl as if she might disappear if he blinked too long. But she did not move, did not retreat. She simply held his gaze with that same quiet certainty that had followed her through miles of empty land. Outside, the night pressed closer against the cabin walls, and the presence beyond the fence did not fade. If anything, it felt steadier now, like it had settled into weight. Ethan finally turned away, not in dismissal, but in thought, pacing once across the worn wooden floor, his boots soft against the boards. Every step measured, like he was trying to place himself back into a moment he had not allowed himself to revisit. "How long has she been out there?" he asked without looking at the girl, his voice low, controlled. The girl's answer came just as quiet, "Since before the sun went down," and something in that response tightened the air again, because it meant the woman had been there before the girl reached the door, before Ethan made the choice to step aside, before any of this had begun to unfold, which meant none of it was chance. Ethan stopped near the window, his hand resting against the frame, and for a second he considered opening the door, walking out into the dark, facing whatever waited there head on, but the thought did not settle right. Not yet, not with the girl still inside. He glanced back at her, noticing the way she now watched him instead of the room, as if his reaction mattered more than anything else. "Why did she not come herself?" he asked, turning fully toward her now, the question direct. The girl lowered her eyes briefly, not in fear, but in something closer to respect. Choosing her words carefully, she said this was your door to open. The sentence hung between them, simple but carrying a weight that pressed against something deep in Ethan's chest. A memory surfaced then, not fully formed, just fragments, a river running fast under gray skies, a woman standing at the edge of it, strong and still even as the current pulled at everything around her, and that same silver catching light in a way that refused to be forgotten. He had not thought of that day in years, had trained himself not to, because remembering meant asking questions he had no answers for. But now the past stood just beyond his fence line, patient, waiting. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand across his jaw before stepping back toward the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from the girl, lowering himself carefully, as if sudden movement might break whatever fragile understanding had formed between them. "You walked all this way alone," he said, not really asking. The girl nodded once. "She walked behind me," she added, her voice steady. "Far enough that I would not turn back, close enough that I would not get lost." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly at that, not in suspicion, but in recognition of the intent behind it. The woman had guided without interfering, had allowed the girl to reach the door on her own terms, had left the choice entirely in his hands. And that choice had already been made the moment he stepped aside. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight. And for a brief second the silence returned. But it was different now, no longer empty. It was filled with everything neither of them had said yet. Outside, the horses shifted again, one of them letting out a low, uneasy breath that carried through the thin walls. Ethan's gaze flicked toward the sound, then back to the girl. "Does she plan to come in?" he asked, the question quiet but edged with something more. The girl shook her head. "Not unless you ask," she said. And there was again that same pattern, that same line drawn not by force but by choice. Ethan felt a faint, almost humorless breath escape him. Not quite a laugh, more like the echo of one. "That sounds like her," he murmured, though he had not meant to say it out loud. The girl tilted her head slightly at that, studying him with a curiosity that had not been there before. "You remember," she said, not as a question but as a realization. Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes drifting to the bracelet once more, the lines etched into it now, impossible to ignore. He reached out this time, slowly, carefully, and his fingers brushed the edge of the silver. The contact light, but enough, and the memory came clearer now, the same pattern in his hand years ago, pressed into his palm with quiet insistence, a voice telling him something he had not understood then, something about paths crossing only once if you chose to walk away. He pulled his hand back, his jaw tightening slightly as he looked up at the girl. "I remember enough," he said, his voice steadier now, grounded in something he had been avoiding but could no longer deny. The girl nodded again, as if that answer was all she needed, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The lantern flame flickering softly between them, casting light that felt too small for everything that now filled the room. Outside, the presence beyond the fence shifted again, closer this time, not stepping forward, not crossing the boundary, but no longer as distant as before. Ethan stood slowly, the chair scraping faintly against the floor, and moved toward the door, his hand hovering just above the latch, not opening it yet, just resting there, feeling the weight of the wood, the thin barrier between what he had built and what had returned. He closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again, his voice low when he finally spoke, not to the girl, not to himself, but to the space beyond the door. "You waited long enough," he said quietly, and for the first time since the night began, the silence outside did not feel empty at all. The latch did not move at first, not because Ethan Cole hesitated, but because something in the air held it there, like the moment before a storm when the world forgets how to breathe. Then slowly, deliberately, his fingers pressed down, and the door opened just enough to let the night slip inside, cool and quiet, carrying the faint scent of dust and sage. He stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath his boots, and for a second he did not look up. He let his eyes adjust, let the darkness settle into shapes he could understand. The fence line stretched out about 30 yards ahead, barely visible except for where the pale moonlight caught the top rail, and beyond it, just where the land dipped slightly before rising again. She stood, not hidden, not approaching, simply there, as if she had been part of the landscape all along. Elena Redbird had not changed in the ways time usually changes a person. There were lines where there had not been before. A stillness in her posture that spoke of years, carried quietly. But her presence remained the same, steady, grounded, like something that did not bend easily to the world around it. Ethan took one step forward, then another, stopping at the edge of the porch, not crossing into the yard. Not yet. The distance between them held meaning now, a line drawn without words. "You could have come to the door," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her. Not raised, not sharp. Elena did not move. Closer. Her reply came just as calm. "It was not my door to open." The answer landed exactly where it needed to, not as an excuse, not as defiance, but as a truth she had decided long before she arrived. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the same quiet refusal to take what was not offered. He had seen it once before, years ago, when the river had been higher and the choices had been fewer. The memory settled between them without needing to be spoken. The girl remained inside the cabin, silent, watching through the narrow space of the doorway. But neither adult turned toward her. This moment did not belong to her. Not yet. You sent her alone, Ethan said after a pause. The words measured, careful. Elena's gaze shifted briefly toward the open door, then back to him. She was not alone, she said, and there was no argument in it. Only a statement shaped by how she saw the world. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing back once toward the cabin before. Stepping down from the porch, the dirt under his boots dry and familiar. Each step closing the distance by inches rather than yards. He stopped just short of the fence, not touching it, not crossing it, and she remained where she was, on the other side of that invisible boundary that had formed long before this night. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. Not empty, not tense, but full of everything neither of them needed to say out loud. The years between them did not feel long in that moment. They felt present, layered into the air like the scent of the land itself. Why now? Ethan asked finally, and it was the only question that mattered. Elena's eyes held his without wavering, and for the first time there was something in them that shifted, not weakness, not regret, but something closer to truth. Because she asked, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. Ethan frowned slightly, not understanding at first. Then slowly the meaning settled. The girl had not been sent as a messenger. She had come because she chose to, because something in her had reached toward a place she had never seen, and Elena had allowed it, had followed but not led, had watched but not interfered. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the ground, then lifted again, studying her more closely now. You could have told her no, he said, quieter this time. Elena shook her head once, the movement small but final. That is not how we raise them, she replied, and there was no pride in it, no challenge, just a difference in how the world was understood. Ethan let that settle. The contrast between what he had known and what he was being shown pressing gently against something he had long since closed off behind him. The door to the cabin creaked slightly, and he knew without turning that the girl had stepped closer, drawn by the quiet shift in the air. But still he did not look back. Not yet. This moment was still unfolding, still deciding what it would become. You left without a word, he said after a while, the sentence coming out slower than he intended, as if each word had to be chosen carefully from a place he rarely visited. Elena did not look away, did not defend herself. So did you, she answered, and there was not accusation, not anger, just the balance of truth placed gently between them. Ethan's shoulders shifted slightly at that, the weight of it settling in a way that did not feel sharp, just real, the kind of real that could not be avoided once it was spoken. The wind moved again, softer this time, carrying the faint sound of the girl's footsteps as she reached the edge of the doorway behind him. And for the first time, Ethan turned, just slightly, enough to see her standing there, the lantern light behind her outlining her small figure against the darkness, her eyes moving between the two of them, not confused, not afraid, but watching, learning, as if this was the moment she had come for. Ethan looked back at Elena, then something in his expression no longer guarded in the same way. Not open, not yet, but changed just enough. You trusted me with her, he said, and it was not a question. Elena's gaze softened, just a fraction, enough to be seen if you knew where to look. I trusted her choose, she replied, and that difference settled into the space between them like something solid, something that would not move no matter how the night unfolded. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the fence between them still untouched, the distance still held, but something had shifted all the same, something quieter than movement, deeper than words. And when he finally stepped back, turning toward the cabin, it was not retreat, not avoidance. It was a decision forming in silence, one that did not need to be spoken yet, because out here, the kind of choices that mattered most were the ones a man carried before he ever said them out loud. The door remained open behind Ethan Cole as he stepped back inside, the night air following him in just enough to remind him that nothing outside had changed, only what stood between him and it. The girl had not moved far from the doorway, her small frame outlined by the lantern glow, but now she shifted slightly to the side as he passed, not out of fear, but out of understanding, as if she knew this space was no longer only hers to hold. Ethan closed the door halfway, not fully, leaving it just open enough for the outside to remain. Present, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever waited beyond the fence was not being shut out. He walked to the table and rested his hand against its worn surface, grounding himself in something familiar, something that had not asked anything of him. For years, the girl watched him carefully, her eyes following every small movement, not with the curiosity of a child, but with the patience of someone who had already seen enough to know that answers did not come quickly. "You knew where to find me," he said after a moment, not looking at her. The statement simple, but weighted. She nodded once, her voice soft but steady. "She told me the land would remember." Ethan's brow tightened slightly at that, the phrase settling into his thoughts in a way that felt both strange and familiar. He glanced toward the window, the darkness beyond it no longer empty in his mind. "Land does not remember," he replied quietly, almost to himself. The girl did not argue, did not correct him. She simply held her ground in silence, and that silence carried more certainty than any words could have. Ethan exhaled slowly, reaching for the tin cup and pouring water again, this time setting it closer to her without hesitation. She took it, her fingers brushing the metal lightly, the bracelet catching the lantern light once more. And this time he did not look away. "She gave you that," he said, nodding toward it. The girl followed his gaze, lifting her wrist slightly. "She said it belonged to you once," she answered, and the words landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Ethan felt something shift deeper this time, not just memory, but the weight of a moment he had left unfinished. He stepped closer, slower than before. And this time he did not stop himself, his fingers closing gently around the edge of the bracelet, the metal cool against his skin, and for a brief second the years between then and now collapsed entirely. He could see it clearly now, not as fragments, but whole. The river, the storm, the decision to leave before dawn without turning back, the quiet understanding that some paths were not meant to cross again. And yet here it was, not returned to him, but carried forward by someone who had never been. Part of that moment, he released the bracelet slowly, his hand falling back to his side. "I gave that away," he said, more to himself than to her. The girl nodded. "She kept it," she replied, her voice carrying something softer now, something that felt closer to explanation than anything before. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the half-open door, the line of night still visible beyond it. "Why did she keep it?" he asked, and this time the question was not about the object. It was about everything that had been left unsaid. The girl hesitated just a fraction, then answered in a way that felt too simple for the weight it carried. "Because you did not take it back." Ethan let out a slow breath at that, the truth in it settling without resistance, not sharp, not painful, just undeniable. He walked toward the door again, stopping just short of it, his hand resting against the frame, the wood worn smooth from years of use. Behind him, the girl remained still, not following, not interrupting. She understood now that whatever came next did not belong to her to shape. Ethan looked out into the dark, his eyes adjusting quickly this time, finding the shape beyond the fence without searching. Elena had not moved closer, had not stepped away. She stood exactly where she had been, patient, unwavering, as if time itself did not press on her the way it did on everything else. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the distance between them unchanged in space, but no longer the same in meaning. He stepped forward again, not stopping at the porch this time, not pausing at the edge. He walked down in the yard, each step quiet, deliberate, until he reached the fence line once more. And this time his hand lifted, resting lightly on the top rail, not crossing, not claiming, just touching, a small gesture that carried more weight than it appeared. Elena's eyes followed the movement, not surprised, not relieved, just aware. "You did not come for shelter," Ethan said, his voice steady, the realization now fully formed. Elena shook her head once, her expression unchanged. "No," she answered simply. The wind moved between them again, softer now, carrying no urgency, no warning, just presence. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the wood of the fence, not in tension, but in thought. Then why come at all? He asked. And the question did not carry accusation, only the need to understand what had already begun. Elena's gaze shifted briefly toward the cabin, where the girl stood in the doorway, watching, then back to him. Because some things are not meant to stay unfinished, she said, and the words did not sound like a request, did not sound like a demand. They sounded like something that had already been decided long before this night. Ethan stood there in the quiet that followed, the fence still between them, the distance still held, but something within that distance had changed, something that no longer felt like separation, but like a choice waiting to be made. And for the first time since the door had opened, he did not feel like he was standing alone on his own land. The fence did not move, but something in Ethan Cole did, subtle and quiet, like a shift in ground that only the one standing on it could feel. His hand still rested on the top rail, fingers curled lightly around the worn wood, and for a long moment he did not speak, because the words that mattered were not the kind that came quickly. They had to settle first, had to find their place in a space that had been empty for too long. Elena Redbird stood across from him, unchanged. In her stillness, her presence neither pressing forward nor pulling away, just there, steady as the land beneath them, the kind of presence that did not ask, did not take, only waited to be met or left behind. The night air moved softly between them, carrying no urgency now, no warning, just a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be decided by force. Ethan finally shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, but easing into the moment as it was. You always knew how to wait, he said, his voice low, almost reflective. Elena's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened just enough to be seen if a man was looking for it. And you always knew how to leave, she replied, not sharp, not accusing, just true, the kind of truth that did not need to be defended. Ethan let out a slow breath at that, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again, meeting hers without hesitation this time. The years between them no longer something he could pretend had faded. They stood there now, present in every word that was not spoken. Behind him, the faint glow from the cabin stretched out across the yard, and he knew the girl was still there, watching, not as a child waiting for direction, but as someone witnessing something she would carry with her long after this night ended. Ethan's hand lifted from the fence at last, but instead of stepping away, he rested both hands on the top rail, leaning slightly into it, not crossing, but no longer holding himself back either. You said some things are not meant to stay unfinished, he said after a pause, his voice steadier now. Elena nodded once, her gaze never leaving his. Yes, she answered simply. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he considered that, not resisting it, just turning it over in his mind, feeling its weight from different sides. Then why bring her, he asked, the question quieter now, more deliberate. Elena's eyes flicked briefly toward the cabin again, then back to him. Because it was never only mine to finish, she said, and the meaning in that settled deeper than anything before. Ethan understood then, not all at once, not in a single clear thought, but in pieces that came together without needing to be forced. This was not about what had been left between him and her, not entirely. It was about what had grown from that moment, what had carried forward beyond his absence. The girl had not come as a messenger. She had come as a bridge, something living between two worlds that had never truly touched. Ethan straightened slightly, his hand still resting on the fence, but his posture no longer guarded in the same way. You could have told me, he said, and this time there was no edge in it, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had not been shared. Elena shook her head once, the movement calm, certain. You would not have listened then, she replied, and again, there was no judgment in it, only truth. Ethan let that settle without argument, because he knew it was right. Back then he had not been a man who stayed long enough to hear what came after. He had been a man who moved on before things could take root. The silence returned for a moment, but it was no longer heavy, no longer filled with what had been avoided. It was open now, like a space waiting to be stepped into. Behind him, the sound of the cabin door shifting slightly reached his ears, and this time he did turn, just enough to see the girl step one pace out onto the porch, her small figure framed by the lantern light. She did not come farther, did not cross into the yard. She stopped there, as if she understood the lines that had been drawn and the ones that were still being decided. Ethan watched her for a second, something in his expression changing again, softer this time, less guarded. Then he looked back at Elena, and for the first time since the night began, his next words did not feel like questions. They felt like something else, something closer to choice. She should not have to stand in the doorway for something that belongs out here, he said quietly. Elena's gaze held his, and for a moment neither of them moved, the meaning in his words clear without needing to be explained. The wind shifted again, brushing lightly against the fence, the land stretching out around them in quiet witness. Ethan took a breath, slow and steady. Then his hands lifted from the rail, and this time, when he moved, he did not stop at the boundary. He stepped forward one pace, crossing the line that had held them apart, not in defiance, not in haste, but with the kind of certainty that only comes when a man finally understands what he has been standing still for. Elena did not step back, did not move to meet him. She simply remained where she was, allowing the distance to close because he chose to close it. And when he stopped a few feet in front of her, the space between them no longer felt like separation. It felt like something shared, something that had been waiting quietly for this moment to arrive. Neither of them spoke right away, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend. The night held steady around them, the fence now behind him, the cabin lights still burning, and the girl standing in the doorway, watching as the space between past and present finally gave way to something that no longer needed to be carried alone. The distance between them was no longer measured in steps, but in silence, and Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of it settling in his chest. Not heavy, not sharp, just present, the kind of presence that does not demand anything but refuses to be ignored. Elena Redbird did not move closer, did not reach out. She simply stood in front of him with the same quiet strength that had not faded with time. And for a moment Ethan found himself searching her face, not for answers, but for something he had once known and then chosen to leave behind. The wind moved gently across the open land, brushing past them as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Behind him the faint glow of the cabin stretched across the ground, and in that doorway the girl still stood, watching, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her small figure caught between two worlds that had not yet decided how to meet. Ethan let out a slow breath, his hands resting loosely at his sides now, no longer braced against anything, no longer holding himself in place. "She has your eyes," he said quietly, the words coming without effort, as if they had been waiting for the right moment to surface. Elena's expression softened just enough to catch the light. Not a smile, not quite, but something close to acknowledgement. "She has her own," she replied, and the answer carried more meaning than correction. Ethan nodded slightly at that, accepting it without argument, because he could see it now. The girl was not a reflection of either of them. She was something else entirely, something that had grown in the space where both had once stood. The silence stretched again, but it no longer felt like distance. It felt like time catching up to itself. "Does she know?" Ethan asked after a moment, his voice steady, not hesitant. Elena held his gaze, her answer simple: "She knows enough," and there was no need to explain further. The rest was not something that could be given in words. It had to be lived, had to be chosen. Ethan glanced back toward the cabin, just briefly, seeing the girl still there, her attention fixed on them. And for the first time he noticed something else in her stance. Not just patience, not just observation, but expectation, not of him, not of her mother, but of the moment itself, as if she understood that something was about to shift in a way that would not be undone. He turned back to Elena, his expression quieter now, less guarded, more certain in a way that did not rely on control. "I left because I thought it was easier," he said, the words low, not offered as an excuse, not shaped as a defense, just spoken as truth. Elena did not interrupt, did not respond immediately. She let the words settle in the space between them, giving them the weight they deserved. "And was it?" she asked after a pause, her voice calm, steady. Ethan considered that, not quickly, not lightly, his gaze drifting for a moment across the land, the miles he had walked alone, the years he had filled with silence and routine, the absence he had mistaken for peace. He shook his head once, slow and certain. "No," he said, and that single word carried more than anything he had said so far. Elena watched him, and for the first time there was something in her expression that shifted beyond stillness. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something like recognition, the kind that comes when a truth is finally spoken out loud. Behind them, the girl took one small step forward onto the porch, not enough to close the distance, but enough to change her place in the scene, enough to show that she was no longer only observing. She was part of what came next. Ethan noticed the movement without turning, felt it more than saw it, and something in him adjusted again, not forced, not sudden, just natural, like a door opening slowly after being closed for too long. "You said this was not your door to open," he said, looking at Elena again, his voice carrying a different tone now, less questioning, more understanding. Elena nodded once. "It was not," she replied. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the cabin, then back to her. And this time there was something else in his eyes, something that had not been there before, not doubt, not distance, but intention, quiet and steady. "Then it is mine," he said, and the words did not sound like a declaration. They sounded like a realization. Elena did not answer right away. She did not need to. The meaning was already clear. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying no tension, no uncertainty, just the quiet rhythm of a night that had found its balance. Ethan turned then, fully this time, his back no longer facing the fence, no longer held by what stood behind him. He walked toward the cabin, each step deliberate but unhurried. And as he approached the porch, the girl did not move aside. She did not step back. She remained where she was, waiting, and when he reached the bottom step, he paused, just for a moment, looking up at her, really looking this time, not as a stranger, not as a question, but as someone standing at the edge of something that had already begun. "You can come in," he said quietly, and the words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything that had come before, because this time the door was not being opened out of hesitation, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice. And as the girl stepped forward, crossing the threshold, not just of the cabin, but of everything that had led her there, Ethan did not look back at the fence. He did not look back at what had been left unfinished, because for the first time, it no longer felt like something behind him. It felt like something he had finally chosen to face the door, closed behind them with a softer sound than before, not a barrier this time, but a settling, like something finally finding its place. Ethan Cole did not move far from it. He stood just inside the cabin, one hand resting lightly against the wood, as if feeling the difference between what had been and what now remained. The girl stepped fully into the room, no longer framed by the doorway, no longer caught between inside and out. She walked slowly toward the table, her steps quiet but certain, as if she had already imagined this space long before she reached it. The lantern light touched her face differently now, no longer revealing a stranger, but something closer to presence, something that belonged without asking permission. Ethan watched her for a moment, not speaking, not interrupting the quiet shift that had taken hold of the room. Outside, the night did not press against the walls the same way. It felt farther now, not because it had moved, but because something inside had changed its meaning. He turned slightly, glancing toward the window, and through the faint reflection of the lantern, he could still see the outline of Elena beyond the fence, still there, still waiting, but no longer distant in the way she had been before. The space between them had already been crossed once, and that crossing did not need to be repeated. The girl reached the table and rested her hand against it, her fingers tracing the worn edges as if reading something written into the grain. Ethan stepped forward then, slower than before, his movements no longer measured by caution, but by intention. "You walked a long way," he said quietly, the words simple, grounded. The girl nodded once. 32 miles, she answered, her voice steady, and the number settled into the room like something solid, not impressive, not exaggerated, just real. Ethan exhaled softly at that, not in surprise, but in recognition of what it meant to choose a path that long without turning back. "And you did not stop," he added, more to understand than to question. The girl shook her head. "If I stopped, I might have changed my mind," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just clarity. Ethan let that settle, his gaze drifting briefly to the bracelet on her wrist again, then back to her face. "What did you come here for?" he asked, and this time the question carried no weight of suspicion, only the quiet need to hear what had already begun to unfold. The girl looked at him directly, her expression unchanged but her voice softer now, not weaker, just more open. "To see if you were the same man she remembered," she said, and the words did not accuse, did not challenge. They simply placed a question into the space between them that had already started to answer itself. Ethan felt that more than he expected, not as pressure, not as judgment, but as something that required honesty. He leaned back slightly against the table, his hands resting flat against it, grounding himself again. "And what do you think?" he asked after a moment. Not defensive, not guarded, just asking. The girl studied him, not quickly, not lightly, her eyes moving across his face in a way that felt older than her years. Then she gave a small, almost unnoticeable shake of her head. "No," she said, and there was no disappointment in it. No disappointment at all, only recognition. Ethan nodded once at that, accepting it without resistance, because he knew it was true. He was not the same man, not the one who had walked away without looking back, not the one who believed leaving was the same as ending. He was something else now, shaped by the silence he had lived in, by the absence he had mistaken for peace. Outside, the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of the land settling into night. Ethan pushed himself away from the table. Stepping toward the small shelf near the wall where a folded blanket rested, he picked it up and placed it over the back of a chair without a word. A quiet gesture, not offered as charity, not as obligation, just as something that belonged to the moment. The girl watched but did not reach for it yet, her attention shifting briefly toward the door, then back to him. "She will stay out there," she said, not as a concern, not as a request, just a statement. Ethan followed her glance, his eyes moving toward the door, the line of darkness still visible beneath it. "She chose that," he replied, and the girl nodded, understanding without needing more. The silence returned then, but it was no longer uncertain. It was settled, like the first moment after a long journey when a person realizes they have arrived somewhere that matters. Ethan moved toward the door again, not opening it, just standing beside it, his hand resting lightly against the frame. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not in thought, not in hesitation, just in acknowledgement of everything that had led to this point. Then he opened them again, turning back toward the girl, his voice quiet but steady. "You can stay," he said, and the words did not sound temporary, did not sound like something that would be reconsidered in the morning. They sounded like a decision that had already taken root. The girl did not smile, did not react in any outward way, but something in her posture shifted, something small but undeniable, as if a weight she had not spoken of had finally been set down. She stepped closer to the chair, her fingers brushing the edge of the blanket, not taking it yet, just touching it, feeling its place in the room. Ethan watched that simple movement, and for the first time since the night began, the quiet around him did not feel like something he had built to keep the world out. It felt like something that could hold more than just himself. And outside, beyond the walls, beyond the fence, the woman who had waited did not move, because she no longer needed to. The door had already been opened where it mattered most. The cabin grew quieter as the night deepened, not empty, but settled, like the land itself had decided to rest around them. Ethan Cole stood near the door a moment longer, his hand still against the frame, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palm, as if it might steady the thoughts that had begun to move in ways he was no longer trying to stop. Behind him the girl remained by the table, her presence no longer unfamiliar, no longer something that needed to be explained. It simply existed in the room the way the lantern light did, steady and unforced. Ethan finally stepped away from the door and crossed the room slowly, his boots soft against the floor. He reached for the kettle near the stove, pouring what little water remained into a cup and setting it on the table without looking at her. A quiet habit, returning without thought, something simple to hold on to in a night that had shifted everything else. The girl sat down then, carefully, not claiming the chair but accepting it, her movements deliberate, as if each one carried meaning. She wrapped her hands around the cup, not drinking yet, just feeling its warmth. Ethan leaned lightly against the edge of the table, his arms resting at his sides, his gaze drifting once more toward the bracelet on her wrist, the same silver catching the lantern, light in a way that refused to fade into the background. "She did not send you here to stay," he said after a moment, the statement quiet, not accusing. The girl looked up at him, her expression unchanged. "No," she answered, simple and clear. Ethan nodded slightly at that, as if he had expected no other answer. The silence that followed did not stretch uncomfortably. It settled, like something understood without needing to be spoken further. Outside, the wind moved again, softer now, brushing lightly against the walls, and in that quiet Ethan could feel the presence beyond the fence still there, not pressing, not waiting for anything to happen, just remaining. As if that was enough, he exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before lifting again. "Then why are you still here?" he asked, not because he doubted her answer, but because he needed to hear what came after it. The girl lowered her eyes for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. Then she spoke, her voice softer now, but no less steady. "Because I have not decided to leave," and the words settled into the room in a way that felt both simple and complete. Ethan studied her for a second, really looking now, not just at her face, but at the way she held herself, the way she did not rush to fill silence, the way she did not ask for permission to exist in the space she had stepped into. And something in that felt familiar, not in memory, but in understanding. He straightened slightly, pushing himself away from the table and walking toward the small window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to look out. The land stretched wide and quiet under the night sky. And there, just beyond the fence line, Elena still stood, her figure steady against the darkness, unchanged, as if time had chosen not to move around her at all. Ethan let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the girl again. "She will not come in," he said, not as a question. The girl shook her head once. "Not unless you ask," she replied, repeating what had already been made clear. Ethan let out a slow breath at that, the weight of choice settling again. Not heavy, not forced, just present. He walked back to the table and pulled out the chair across from her, sitting down this time, not leaning, not standing, but placing himself in the moment fully. "You said you came to see if I was the same man," he said, his voice even. The girl nodded, watching him closely. "And you said I am not." He continued, not challenging it, just acknowledging it. She nodded again. Ethan rested his hands on the table, his fingers lightly touching the worn surface, grounding himself in something real, something unchanged. "Then why stay?" he asked, and this time the question carried something deeper. Not doubt, not uncertainty, but the need to understand what had already begun to take shape between them. The girl looked at him steadily, her eyes clear, her voice quiet but certain. "Because different does not mean gone," she said, and the words did not try to convince, did not try to explain. They simply existed, like a truth she had already accepted before she ever reached his door. Ethan felt that settle somewhere deeper than the rest, not as a thought, but as something closer to recognition. He leaned back slightly in the chair, his gaze drifting briefly to the lantern, then back to her. "And what if I had closed the door?" he asked, not because he needed to know, but because the question had been there since the moment he first saw her standing outside. The girl did not hesitate. "Then I would have kept walking," she said, and there was no sadness in it, no regret, just acceptance, the kind that does not depend on what someone else chooses. Ethan nodded once at that, the answer landing exactly where it needed to, because it told him something more than what might have happened. It told him who she was, and by extension, who Elena had raised her to be. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound. Across the land, not a warning, not a call, just movement. Ethan glanced toward the door, then back at the girl, and for the first time since she had arrived, something in his expression changed in a way that did not belong to the past. It belonged to what came next. He stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked toward the door once more, stopping with his hand resting against it. Not opening it yet, just feeling the boundary, the choice, the moment. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear, not directed at the girl, not fully directed at the woman outside, but existing between them both. "No one waits outside my door unless they belong there," he said, and the words did not sound like a rule. They sounded like a decision. And for the first time that night, the space inside the cabin did not feel like something he had built to keep the world away. It felt like something he was beginning to share. The words did not echo. They settled, quiet and certain. And Ethan Cole stood there with his hand still resting against the door, feeling the weight of what he had just said more than hearing it. Because out here, a man's words did not drift away. They stayed. They shaped what came next. Behind him, the girl remained seated at the table, still as before, but something in her posture had changed again. Not waiting now, not uncertain, just present in a way that no longer asked permission. Ethan drew a slow breath and lifted the latch, the door opening wider this time. Not a crack, not a question, but an invitation that did not need to be spoken twice. The night air moved in gently, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and cool earth. And beyond the threshold, the yard stretched quiet and open. The fence no longer a line that divided, but something that had already been crossed. Elena Redbird stood where she had remained, her figure steady in the dim light, but now the distance between them did not feel like something fixed. It felt like something waiting to be closed. Ethan stepped out onto the porch again, his boots pressing softly against the wood. But this time he did not stop there. He moved down into the yard without hesitation, the ground familiar beneath him, each step carrying none of the weight it had before, because the decision had already been made. He reached the fence and did not pause, his hand lifting to the top rail only long enough to steady himself before he stepped past it, not carefully, not cautiously, just naturally, as if the boundary had never truly been there to begin with. Elena watched him approach, her expression unchanged but her eyes steady, following each step without urgency, without expectation, just awareness. Ethan stopped a few feet in front of her, the space between them smaller now, no longer measured in distance but in presence. And for a moment neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to test, nothing left to prove. The night held still around them, the land quiet, the wind moving softly through the open space. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice low, not uncertain, not guarded, just clear. "You can come in," he said, and the words did not sound like an offer. They sounded like something that had already been decided long before they were spoken. Elena did not answer immediately. She did not move forward. She simply looked at him, and in that look there was something deeper than hesitation, something that measured not the invitation itself, but the man who had given it. Ethan did not look away, did not shift. He held that moment without trying to fill it, because he understood now that some things were not accepted quickly. They were felt, weighed, allowed to settle before they were taken. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was full of everything that had led them here, every step not taken, every word not said, every moment that had been left unfinished until now. And then, slowly, Elena stepped forward, not crossing the distance all at once, but closing it in a way that matched the night itself. Steady, unhurried, certain. When she reached him, she did not stop close enough to touch. She stopped just short, leaving a small space between them, a space that no longer separated, but connected because it existed by choice, not by distance. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the bracelet on the girl's wrist in his memory, then returned to her face. And for the first time, there was no past pressing between them. No unfinished weight, just the present, simple and real. Behind them, the cabin stood with its door open, the lantern light spilling out into the yard. Reaching just far enough to touch the edge of where they stood, the girl remained inside, but not hidden, not distant. She stood in the doorway, watching, her presence now part of the moment instead of apart from it. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to gesture toward the cabin without breaking the space between them. Not commanding, not urging, just allowing. Elena followed the movement with her eyes, her gaze shifting briefly toward the light, toward the place that had not been hers to enter until now, then back to him. And in that brief motion something settled, something quiet and final. She stepped past him then, not brushing against him, not pausing, just moving forward into the yard, toward the porch, toward the open door that waited without demand. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, watching her cross the ground, He had walked alone for years, and for the first time it did not feel like something being taken from him. It felt like something being returned, something that had always been there, but had never been allowed to exist fully. He followed a step behind, not leading, not guiding, just present. And as Elena reached the porch and stepped inside, the light shifting around her, the space within the cabin adjusting to include her without resistance. Ethan understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. The door had not just been opened, it had been claimed, not by force, not by obligation, but by choice, and in that choice, everything that had once stood apart had found a way to stand together without losing what made it different the moment the threshold was crossed. The cabin did not feel smaller. It felt deeper, as if the space itself had been waiting to hold more than one life at a time. Ethan Cole stepped in behind Elena Redbird, closing the door slowly, not shutting anything out, but settling what had been opened, the latch resting in a place with a quiet certainty that echoed differently now. Not final, not isolating, just complete. The lantern light shifted across the room, touching both of them where they stood, and for a brief second neither moved. Not because they did not know where to go, but because the moment itself needed to settle into something real. The girl stood near the table, her eyes moving from her mother to Ethan, not searching, not questioning, just taking in what had already begun to take shape. Elena took a few steps forward, not cautiously, not carefully, but with the same steady presence she had held outside, her gaze moving across the cabin, not inspecting, not judging, simply acknowledging the space as it was. Ethan watched her from where he stood, not stepping ahead, not directing, allowing her to move through the room on her own terms. Just as she had allowed him to make a choice before, the quiet between them was no longer something fragile. It was grounded, something that could hold weight without breaking. Elena stopped near the table, her hand resting lightly against the wood, the same place her daughter had stood not long before. The same place where something had shifted without needing to be. Named. "It has been a long time," she said quietly, her voice carrying no accusation, no regret, just acknowledgement. Ethan nodded once, the movement small but certain. "It has," he replied, and the words did not try to fill the space. They simply marked it. The girl remained still, her presence steady between them, not as a divide, but as something that connected, something that had made this moment possible without forcing it. Ethan moved then, walking past the table toward the small shelf where he had placed the blanket earlier. He picked up another one, worn but clean, and set it gently over the back of a second chair, not offering it directly, not placing it into anyone's hands, just making space for it to be used. Elena noticed the gesture, her eyes following the movement briefly before returning to him. And for a moment, there was something in her expression that shifted again. Not surprise, not expectation, just recognition of something that had not been there before, not in him, not in the way he had chosen to move through the world. "You stayed," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a different weight now. Ethan leaned lightly against the edge of the table, his hands resting flat against it, grounding himself as he had done before. "I learned how," he answered, and there was no pride in it. No need to explain how long it had taken. The truth was enough. The silence that followed did not stretch. It settled like something that had finally reached the place it was meant to be outside. The wind moved softly against the walls, but no longer felt like something waiting to come in. It felt like something passing by, something that did not need to be held back anymore. The girl shifted slightly, stepping closer to her mother, not out of need, not out of fear, but out of quiet instinct. Elena's hand rested briefly against her shoulder. A simple touch that said everything it needed to without words. Ethan watched that, and for a moment his gaze softened in a way that did not belong to the man he had been before. It belonged to the one he had become, shaped not by what he had left, but by what he had finally chosen to face. "She walked all the way here," he said, his voice low, not as a question. Elena nodded once, her hand still resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder. "She chose to," she replied, and again, the difference mattered. Ethan let that settle, understanding now That choice had been at the center of everything that had happened. Not chance, not fate, but the quiet decisions made without demand. He straightened slightly, pushing away from the table, his posture no longer guarded, no longer braced against something unseen. And now, he said, the words pausing there, not because he did not know how to finish them, but because he understood that the next part was not his alone to speak. Elena met his gaze, steady as before. Now we do not leave things unfinished, she said. And the sentence did not sound like a promise. It sounded like a truth that had already taken root. Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of it settling in a way that did not feel heavy, just real. He glanced toward the door briefly, then back to them. And for the first time since the night began, there was no pull to step away, no instinct to retreat into the silence he had once built around himself. Instead, there was something else, something quieter but stronger, the understanding that what stood in front of him did not need to be explained, did not need to be fixed. It only needed to be lived. He moved toward the small stove, adjusting the fire slightly, the flames rising just enough to warm the room more evenly. A simple act, but one that carried meaning now, not for himself, but for all of them. The cabin no longer held just one life. It held three, and it did so without resistance, without strain, as if it had always been meant to. Elena watched him for a moment, then stepped closer to the table, taking the chair he had prepared without hesitation, her daughter following, not sitting, yet just standing beside her. And in that quiet arrangement, something settled fully for the first time. Not a beginning, not an ending, but something in between, something steady, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And in the soft glow of the lantern, with the wind moving gently outside, and the door no longer a barrier but a boundary chosen and crossed, Ethan Cole stood in a place that was no longer defined by solitude, but by the presence he had finally allowed to remain. The fire settled into a steady glow, no longer flickering with uncertainty, and Ethan Cole stood beside it for a moment longer than needed, watching the way the light filled the room without asking permission from anyone inside it. The warmth spread slowly, touching the edges of the cabin, softening the sharp corners that had once held only silence. Behind him, Elena Redbird sat at the table, her posture calm, her presence no longer outside the space but woven into it. Her daughter stood close by, not leaning, not clinging, just near enough to show that distance no longer defined where she belonged. Ethan turned from the fire and faced them, not as a man guarding his space, but as someone learning how to share it. The shift was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there in the way he moved, in the way he did not pause before stepping closer. You did not come for a night, he said, his voice low, steady, not questioning. Elena lifted her gaze to meet his, her expression unchanged, but her eyes clear. No, she answered, and the simplicity of it carried no demand, only truth. Ethan nodded once, accepting it as it was, because there was no weight in it that needed to be resisted, only something that needed to be understood. The girl moved then, taking the chair beside her mother, not waiting to be told, not asking, just choosing her place with the same quiet certainty she had carried across the miles that brought her here. Ethan watched that small movement, and something in his chest settled in a way he had not felt in years. Not relief, not ease, but something steadier, something that did not depend on being alone. He stepped toward the table, pulling the remaining chair slightly closer without thinking, aligning it so that the space between them felt less like separation and more like connection. Then he sat, not across from them as before, but at an angle that did not divide. A small shift, but one that changed the way the room held them. The silence that followed did not stretch awkwardly. It rested like something that had finally found its place. The land out here, Ethan said after a moment, his voice thoughtful now, not heavy. It teaches a man to keep things simple. Elena listened without interrupting, her attention steady. You fix what is broken, you mend what you can, and what you cannot, you leave behind, he continued, his gaze drifting briefly to the worn wood of the table, the marks and lines that told stories without words. I thought that was enough, he added quietly. And in that sentence there was no regret, only acknowledgement. Elena's eyes remained on him, and when she spoke, Her voice carried the same calm certainty it always had. "Some things are not broken," she said. "They're only left waiting." The words settled into the room without resistance, and Ethan did not argue them, did not question them, because he could feel the truth in them the same way he could feel the heat from the fire. Steady and undeniable, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely against his knees, no longer needing to hold onto the table for balance. "I did not know how to stay," he said, the admission simple, not shaped to sound like anything more than it was. Elena nodded once. Not in agreement, not in correction, but in understanding. "Now you do," she replied. And again, there was no judgment in it, only recognition of what had already changed. The girl looked between them, her eyes moving slowly, not trying to follow every word, but feeling the space between them, understanding what had been said without needing to hear it all. Ethan glanced toward her then, and for the first time his expression held something lighter, not a smile, not quite, but something close to it, something that did not belong to the past. "You walked 32 miles to ask a question," he said to her, and the girl met his gaze, her posture straight, her voice quiet but certain. "Yes," she answered. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Then you deserve an answer," he said, and the weight of that did not come from the words themselves, but from the way he meant them, the way he no longer avoided what needed to be faced. The girl did not respond right away. She simply watched him, as if measuring the truth of what he had said against what she had already seen, and after a moment, she gave a small nod. Not because she needed reassurance, but because she recognized it. When it was given honestly outside, the wind moved softly across the land, carrying nothing with it now. No tension, no presence waiting beyond the fence, because there was nothing left outside that had not already been brought in. The cabin held everything that mattered in that moment, and it did so without strain, without resistance, as if it had always been meant to. Ethan stood then, not abruptly, not to leave, but to move, to act in a way that matched what had already settled inside him. He walked to the door and opened it slightly, not wide, not as before, just enough to let the night air move through once more. And for a moment he stood there, looking out at the land that had once defined his solitude, and now did not feel empty in the same way. Then he closed it again, gently, the latch falling into place with a quiet certainty. When he turned back, his gaze moved between Elena and her daughter, and there was no hesitation left in it. No distance, only presence. And in that presence, the past no longer stood between them as something unfinished. It stood behind them as something that had finally found its place, not erased, not forgotten, but understood. And in the soft glow of the lantern, with the fire steady and the night settled, the cabin held not just what had returned, but what had been chosen to remain the night did not rush toward morning. It unfolded slowly, like it understood that something inside the cabin needed time to settle fully into what it had become. Ethan Cole stood for a while after closing the door, his hand still resting lightly against it, not because he needed to hold it there, but because he was feeling the difference. The quiet shift between a door that once kept everything out and one that now held something in. He turned back toward the room, the lantern casting a steady glow, the fire low but warm, and for the first time in years the space did not feel like it belonged to only one man. Elena Redbird remained seated at the table, her posture unchanged, her presence calm and rooted as if she had always been part of the place. Her daughter sat beside her now, the blanket resting across her lap, not pulled close, not clutched, just there, accepted. Ethan stepped forward slowly, not with hesitation, but with a kind of awareness that did not need to rush. He moved to the table and rested his hand against the worn surface once more, the same place where everything had begun to shift hours earlier. And for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing left to explain. The silence that filled the room now was not empty. It was full, like a breath that did not need to be released right away. "It will be cold before sunrise," he said finally, his voice low, practical, but carrying something more than simple observation. Elena nodded once, her eyes meeting his. "We have known colder," she replied, and there was no challenge in it, no distance, just a shared understanding of what the land demanded and what it gave in return. Ethan let out a small breath at that. Not quite a laugh, but something lighter than anything that had come before, and he nodded once, acknowledging the truth without needing to add to it. The girl shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting over the blanket now, her eyes moving between them, not searching, not questioning, just present, as if she understood that this was not the kind of moment that needed words to complete. Ethan glanced at her, and something in his expression softened again, not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because he saw her now not as someone who had arrived, but as someone who had chosen to stay, and that difference mattered more than anything else. He moved toward the small shelf and reached for another cup, filling it with water and placing it gently beside her. A quiet gesture, nothing more, but it did not need to be. The meaning was already there. The fire cracked softly. Behind him, the sound low and steady, filling the spaces between words that no longer needed to be spoken outside. The wind moved across the land, but it did not press against the cabin. It passed by, as if it understood that what mattered was no longer out there, but here within these walls. Ethan returned to the table and took his seat again, not across from them, not separate, but part of the same space. His posture relaxed in a way that did not feel forced. It felt earned, and for a while. None of them spoke because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to decide. The choices had already been made, not in a single moment, but in all the small ones that had led here. Elena's gaze drifted briefly toward the door, then back to Ethan. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something final, something that did not need to be revisited. "We will leave in the morning," she said, and the words did not sound like departure. They sounded like part of the rhythm of the world they belonged to. Ethan did not react right away. He let the sentence settle. Let it find its place beside everything else that had been said and everything that had not. Then he nodded once, not in agreement, not in resistance, but in understanding. "The land does not hold anyone forever," he replied, his voice steady. And there was no sadness in it, no reluctance, only truth. Elena watched him for a moment, and in that look there was something that had not been there before. Not distance, not waiting, but recognition, the kind that comes when something unfinished is no longer left behind. The girl looked at him then, her eyes steady, and after a moment she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "But it remembers," she said, and the words settled into the room like the final piece of something that had been building all along. Ethan met her gaze, and this time he did not look away, did not question it. He simply nodded, because he understood now that memory was not something held by the land alone. It was carried by the people who chose to return, who chose to stay, even if only for a while. The fire burned low, the lantern light softened, and the night moved gently toward its end. But inside the cabin, nothing felt like it was ending. It felt like something had been set into place, something quiet, something steady, something that would not need to be undone. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze moving once more between Elena and her daughter. And for the first time since the door had opened, there was no sense of distance left, no line dividing what was his from what was not. Only the understanding that what mattered had found its way here without force, without demand, simply by being chosen. And in that quiet moment, with the fire low and the wind passing gently outside, Ethan Cole understood something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Out here, justice did not come with noise. It did not arrive with force. It arrived in the quiet decisions a man made when no one was watching. And sometimes it looked like a door left open just long enough for the right people to walk through.